I think we're good to go. How many do we have in the room?
We have a total of 12, including us.
Including us.
I'm good?
Okay. Yep. Sounds good. Let's get started.
Well, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Gary Gutierrez. I am the current president of the North Carolina Composting Council, and I am the grounds control for today's on-site webinar. Thank you all for joining us on our 5th day of International Compost Awareness Week 2021. It's my pleasure to introduce Muriel Williman, who many of you may know already. If not, she is a co-board member and soon to be president of the North Carolina Compost Council. So Muriel, take it away. If you could, everyone, make sure you're muted. I think I did mute all. And if you have any trouble, just go ahead and chat away. Muriel, all yours.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If there's any issues, just send a message in the chat box and Gary can communicate that to us here at the site. I'm also being filmed, just so you know, by Kate Sullivan. She's also a co-board member of the North Carolina Composting Council. So we are in the house here at the City of Durham Solid Waste Management Department, where I work as the assistant manager for the Waste Disposal and Recycling Center. And this facility is where the city's transfer station is, and the full service convenience center, and the yard waste composting facility. So this is a side gig. It's one of my favorite things to teach. I've been teaching backyard composting for about 20 years, and I've taught this class many times, so but it never gets old. So if you're interested, if you want to maybe pop in the chat some of the things you hope to learn from this class, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat as well, and Gary will read them out to me and I'll hear them here in my earbuds and incorporate that into the class that I'll be teaching. If there's any questions after the class, we'll be sure to get back to you. Just make sure that your contact information is relayed as well. So just to start out, I always like to start with the basics. Why do you want to compost? Well, there's a lot of different reasons why you might want to. The City of Durham, like many waste management departments, did a waste composition study of the city residents. And this is the results of the composition study. And as you can see, almost a full third, I should say, of the pie is food waste at 18% and low-grade paper at 10%. So if you just look at this as being the basics of a composting program, 30% of what is currently being landfilled could readily be composted. And 30% is a huge chunk of the pie. For a waste management program, food waste is the heaviest material. Also, when it goes into a landfill, it's the most volatile. So it breaks down without oxygen inside a landfill and produces methane, the most potent of the greenhouse gases. And also because it contains so much moisture, it's the main component of producing leachate, which also has to be captured and managed by landfills in North Carolina, has to be tested, all that stuff. So the volatility of food waste in a landfill is costly. Hauling it is costly because it's so heavy, and it's a resource that could actually be made into a beautiful brown crumbly soil amendment that adds nutrients, all manner of benefits to soil health, biodiversity, and the ability to hold water, the ability to sustain plant growth. I will talk about that more later. Back to the basics. So if you are like many of us in this pandemic, if you've been cooking more at home, maybe you're noticing how much food waste you're producing. A lot of people, think that backyard composting is difficult. It's really, for myself, I learned by doing. I grew up in upstate New York, and my mom is a prolific gardener, and she taught me how to compost. So I like to say everything I learned about dirt, I learned from my mom, but also, Mother Nature. You learn by doing, and it's really nature's way of returning nutrients back to the soil to be taken up by microorganisms and plant life and feeding animals and so forth. So when we compost, we're really just encapsulating a natural process that happens anyway. So if you put the ingredients together, you can't stop it. It's going to happen, whether it happens quickly or slowly. Those are the things that we're going to talk about in the class, how you can make it actually happen in a way that benefits you. So there are 4 basic ingredients in any composting: carbon, nitrogen, water, air. That's it. So carbon comes in many different forms, and I'm going to demonstrate those in a minute, but brown, woody material. Nitrogen is the fuel that burns the carbon. It's the nutritious, they call it greens in a lot of literature, but it's not just green. If it's fresh vegetative waste, that's going to contain most of your nitrogen. Water, obviously, this site is not the best because it doesn't actually have a hose coming to it, but siting your backyard compost where you can water it with a hose is recommended. And then air, you know, obviously there's, if you don't compact it, if you have a pitchfork, if you have aeration around your container, then the air is abundant, and that will help keep your compost from getting smelly. If it has oxygen, then it is breaking down in a manner we call aerobic composting. And that is absolutely what you want, because anaerobic composting is stinky. So probably the biggest complaints that I hear about compost, or maybe the fears of compost, is that it attracts bugs, it attracts vermin, it smells bad, it's too hard. So hopefully by the end of this class, you'll be reassured that you can do it without an overabundance of flies. You can learn how to control them. It is not an ecosystem that attracts vermin, rodents, and things like that. You're trying to build a soil ecosystem that has decomposers coming up through the soil to break down the nutritious carbon and nitrogen that you put inside. And the odor can be mitigated by the proper balance of carbon and nitrogen in the presence of air. Okay, so so those are the basics. This is kind of a schematic that shows the different ingredients, but layering your compost is one way of doing it, but really what we want to do is kind of mix it all together, and I'm going to demonstrate that in just a moment. Let's go over here first though. And before we go any further, I actually want to talk about indoor composting system. This is a vermicomposting bin. A lot of people say, well, if I'm going to be composting, I need to have worms. And it's kind of a confusion, I think, that stems from these indoor systems. Vermicomposting systems are very easy, but they work well inside. In an outdoor system, if you feed them, they will come. And so you don't have to add worms or anything like that. They will come up through the soil. And it's really not the biggest benefit of outdoor composting. Indoor composting, though, I like to start with this portion of the class because it encapsulates all of the fundamentals of composting in a small container. So this is a compost bin that I keep in my office. And of course, the first thing that people say when they hear me say that I'm, you know, want to see my worms, I've got them under my desk, they're like, oh my gosh, it must stink, or it's full of flies. So I'm going to open up the bin, going to do the big reveal. No bugs whatsoever. And I mean, this isn't smell-o-vision, but I can assure you that the only odor that's coming from this is a warm, earthy smell. If that, it's really, Kate's assuring me that she's like, I got nothing over here. So, so this is what you want. I don't know if you noticed here, if you want to peer down in, there's a solid layer of carbon. In my worm bin, I like to use newspaper as my carbon source. Of course, everybody knows that paper comes from trees, but newspaper is often made from recycled content. So I feel good about putting that in my worm bin. And I keep a thick layer of carbon, this wet newspaper in the worm bin example, on top because it does discourage flies. I want to feed the worms, which are down inside this bin. And so I bury my food waste and the worms are there where the food is. Flies are surface to air organisms. They land on the surface to feed and then, you know, lay their eggs, do their business on the surface. They're not going to want to crawl through wet carbon to get to the food source. They just don't like it. It gets their little wings wet. You know, it's not their thing. They want to land on top and feed. So if you don't put the food on top, then they're not going to have anything to do. So you won't have a problem. If for some reason, you know, someone comes and throws something on top of your compost and it starts to populate with flies, all you have to do is bury it, cover it with compost and a carbon layer, and that will discourage flies. You might still get a few, but you won't have a massive population problem. Just give it time and keep it covered and keep it wet, and that will discourage flies for certain. So I do say keep it wet. So this is my carbon source, and as you can see, it's quite moist to the touch. I'm going to give it a little squeeze and see. Yeah, you can see those water droplets coming out. This is what we call 70% saturation. And that is the kind of wetness that you want your compost, whether you're composting indoors or out. 60 to 70% wetness. The reason for that is because that's where bacteria lives. If your compost gets too dry, it'll just mummify. And you really need the bacterial life to be breaking things down. Even the worms eat bacteria. You know, they also eat your rotting food, but they're also eating the bacteria that's helping the food break down, and even this carbon breakdown too. So you need that moisture in order for the microbes to thrive. And that's what it's all about. The microbes do the work, and it creates a really diverse ecosystem, a microbial ecosystem that supports then the the macrobiome of worms, millipedes, centipedes, and other soil dwelling decomposers. So as you can see, I've got plenty of food waste in here. Like I said, I keep this in my office. So I am super picky about what goes in my worm bin. Honestly, fresh off the cutting board, strictly fruits and veggies. You know, this carrot was sprouting in my veggie drawer, so chopped off the top, went ahead and ate it. This strawberry went a little too long, got a little moldy, but the worms just love it. So that's the nitrogen source. Most organisms are going to go for the nitrogen. That's where the energy is. That's where the nutrients are, and the worms are going to digest that nitrogenous nutrition and then produce a very nutritious compost. It's worm castings. It is worm poo. Yes, I am pawing my hands through some worm castings, and I feel pretty good about it, actually, because it is from food that I myself ate. So I feel pretty all right about it. I will wash my hands, so I promise. At any rate, so this is the resulting compost. It is brown, rich, crumbly, and this is the conversion of nutrients from the food that we eat into a substance that makes it available for plant growth. So I can't plant directly in this compost. I actually have to mix it with a mineral soil in order for it to be a good soil mix for plants to thrive in. But this is loaded with the same nutrients of the food that I eat. Nitrogen, certainly, potassium, calcium, you know, all of these things that are vital for healthy growth at the human level also are vital for healthy growth at the soil level, the plant level, and so forth. So I just get so excited about it. I've you know, been on a kick of vermicomposting since I was in college, and you know, I lived in a 4th floor apartment. I was surrounded by brick and concrete, and having grown up with composting, I was a little at a loss. And then a friend of mine in the environmental studies program at SUNY Binghamton gave me a handful of her worms and taught me how to compost indoors. So I've been doing it ever since. These are like the great grandworms of the worms that I had when I was in college. I've been composting and sharing and teaching with them ever since. They make great gifts. Graduation season is upon us. You do need a special species of worm, however. These are called Asenia fetida. And they're a non-burrowing type of worm. If you go to a bait store and ask for worms, you may get nightcrawler hybrids that burrow hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the soil. They do a great job. They grab organic matter from the surface, bring it down below the surface, and they mix the organic and the mineral layer of soils. They help aerate the soils, but you know what? They will not thrive in a small container like this. You need a non-burrowing species of worm like Asenia fetida. Asenia fetida are probably the most popular because they survive so well in a container. And for them, you know, the food comes out of the sky. I just provide them the best worm habitat. It's wet, it's dark, and loads of nutritious organic matter. And then I get this beautiful rocket fuel that I can add to my garden, grow my own vegetables, and feed myself and my friends. Okay, so that's the worm bin. Carbon, nitrogen, water. that moisture, that 60–70% saturation, and air. So there's air holes in the side of the bin, but also, believe it or not, this wet carbon adds aeration too. So I'm not going to give this compost a squeeze, but it's got that same level of moisture, but look how crumbly it is, right? So it's got air pockets in it. So even though we've got 60–70% moisture saturation, there's still plenty of air. And the reason for that, you want to pull in here, Kate, if you can see, you could even see the newspaper fibers that are in there. So the carbon creates structure and porosity in the compost. So even though it's wet, that carbon is really kind of puffing it up and creating this structure that allows air to exist even though it's very wet. So carbon is absolutely necessary for so many reasons. It helps reduce odors by providing that aeration. Also, you know, carbon filters, it's no joke, they do actually help absorb odors. So that's another benefit of carbon, covering your bin, incorporating it into your compost, and it creates that beautiful structure and porosity while preventing flies. So bonus. Now, this is a worm bin, as I said. It's not the same as outdoor composting. Outdoor composting is an entirely different kind of magic. Let's go over here. So you can compost outdoors using a variety of methods, but the big thing about backyard composting, the big difference between indoor composting with worms and outdoor composting is that you can create a hot compost with your outdoor compost. Yes?
I'm sorry, real quick. How do you spell the worm that you were talking about there?
Okay, spelling quiz. EISENIA, Eisenia foetida, FOETIDA, I think. Eisenia foetida, vermicomposting worms. There's actually a worm dealer, if you will, here in Durham, called New Soil Vermiculture, and they have a wonderful worm farm. You can Google that if you're looking for composting indoors with worms. I don't recommend putting vermicomposting worms in your outdoor bin unless you want a big vermicompost bin outside. For me personally, I like to have a hot compost, and worms will eat the bacteria that makes it hot. Worms like it cool, and I like my outdoor compost hot. So the magic with that is when you combine carbon and nitrogen in the presence of water, they actually react with each other chemically. I think I mentioned earlier that nitrogen is the fuel that burns the carbon. And so with the combination of carbon and nitrogen reacting together, you can actually get a heat surge in your outdoor compost. And it supports what is known as thermophilic bacteria. Thermophilic, heat-loving bacteria is the Latin root of that word. And so they love it hot and they make it hot. And so they'll actually eat the nitrogen that's breaking down in your bin, and they thrive in a hot environment that you can create by having a proper balance of carbon and nitrogen. So like I said, oops, let me grab this one real quick. Like I said earlier, nitrogen might be called green. This is actually my home compost bin. I got this cute little beauty at a thrift store, kept my eyes open, but I'm going to talk about containers a little bit more. So this is my food waste from just the last like 12 hours, maybe 18 hours. I had a sweet potato for dinner and a salad and an orange for my breakfast, and of course the most vital ingredient of my day, coffee. And so all of this is just my food waste from the last 18 hours or so. So instead of landfilling this colorful mix of nitrogen is going to go into the compost. You know, this wonderful nutrient-rich material. But as you can see, it is far from all green. So a lot of the literature calls nitrogen greens. It's not just green grass. It's not just green lettuce leaves. You know, the red strawberry, your purple eggplant, your red pepper, all of that, your yellow banana peel. If it came from a plant, it's good to go. Some things are are problematic in your nitrogen stream. I do compost orange peels. I don't put them in my worm bin, however. There's a couple things about orange peels and other citrus. They are very acidic, and you know that and you might even get cleaners that have orange peel or orange essence in it because it is fundamentally antibacterial. So you don't want to overload your compost with too much citrus. Also, because it's so acidic, it has a tendency to get moldy. I'm very fortunate. I don't have mold sensitivity, but a lot of people do. So if you're sensitive to mold, you want to make sure to really bury your citrus. Also, bread and other baked goods can also mold. I have a little teeny tiny bread heel here. Otherwise, I try not to waste baked goods. But because of the I guess the wheat and so forth, that bread also has a tendency to mold. You can put it in your compost. I would never put it in an indoor worm bin, but outside it does just fine. The other benefit of having this hot compost is that it breaks stuff down that chunky, funky stuff that I pull out of my veggie drawer, like, oh, I left that too long, I don't mind putting it in there. And it might take a little longer to break down if it's really dense. But those are some of the nitrogenous waste that I try to watch out for. Not too much citrus, but otherwise a really wide variety of foods does best in my experience. If you have a good various diet, you can put that in your compost. So the important thing though to keep in mind, a lot of the literature does say that you want a carbon to nitrogen balance of 30-1. The first time I read that, I was like, what? That makes no sense at all. I need 30 bags of leaves and 1 bag of kitchen scraps. No, that can't be right. I mean, I composted all my life. It's not that much volume. So the secret is that even though we consider this nitrogenous waste, it also has carbon, right? We are carbon-based life forms. You can't have nitrogen in structure without carbon too. So food waste might have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of maybe 20-1. Brown leaves have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of, maybe 30-1, 50-1. Okay, so if you're interested in doing the math to find out what 30-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is, I say go for it. Personally, I just prefer to go by volume. It's a lot easier. So, you might read 30-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, but my experience is that 50-50 or 30-70, 50-50, 40-60, something like that, with a little bit more on the carbon side, as a volume works really well. The other thing, of course, is that you need to make it wet, wet, wet. So I have a variety of carbon and nitrogen that I brought to the party here today. So the other secret with backyard composting is that you have to have a volume of material. You have to have that critical mass in order to have the chemical reaction that I was talking about. A little shallow bit of compost is not going to get you where you want to be, where you're developing a compost that can go anywhere from 100 degrees to 130 degrees. And this is a compost thermometer. They cost about 20 bucks, and it's got this long probe that you can stick right in your compost, and you can see how you're doing in terms of temperature. Today's ambient temperature is about 68. But I'm going to build what hopefully will be a hot compost pile. And then, if you're in Durham, you can come back and look at it. But I would hope that within, just 24 hours or so that temperature would start to rise. And it does, because that's what happens when you mix carbon or nitrogen together in a proper volume in the presence of water. It just does. So this demonstration site, the last time I used it was in October of last year. We did a similar Zoom class like this for the city of Durham, had a lot of fun, and all of the ingredients that I have here today is basically how I teach this class. So that's what I put in this composting system. So and in that time, since the month of October, I have not been here at all. This is what we call passive composting. So in that time, wow, look at those worms. I did not add them, I promise. I keep my worms inside. But these guys, they, like I said, if you feed them, they will come. And so this is the compost, completely passive, not churning at all, with the ingredients that I will show you here today. 50-50 approximately mix of carbon to nitrogen. That's a pretty good looking compost. Kate is in agreement, and she's in the know. She knows what looks good. All right. Oh, and hey, look, we even have a volunteer squash. Maybe it's a cucumber. We have a volunteer growing, but unfortunately I'm going to have to sacrifice them. And, you know, one of the plagues, of course, of compost are some contaminants. Why are we putting a plastic sticker on every single vegetable that we sell? I don't know. But plastic produce labels are the bane of composters everywhere. So I work really hard to peel mine off so they don't end up in the compost. But at any rate, so this is a kind of a passive pile. I filled it up about maybe 2 feet and it literally broke down. I put leaves on top of it, and it was on the inside where the carbon and nitrogen were reacting with each other, and it literally broke down to, I would say, a quarter of its original volume. So the same thing with this container over here. Back in October, you know, everybody's mowing their lawns, and you know, in the fall, you've got a good mix of brown leaves and green grass. If you mulch those materials together, it makes a wonderful, wonderful compost mix, the cut green grass and brown leaves. I filled this, I'm not kidding you, smack full. It was completely full, and look how far it's broken down. So let's see what that did. Not a whole lot. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, it had a lot more carbon than nitrogen, but that nitrogen broke right down. And this is actually, I mean, this is a really nice leaf mold for sure, and it's got some worm activity. I mean, this is, I would add this to my compost, you know, this is ready to break down in my hands. So this is a beautiful remaining bit of carbon. All of the nitrogen broke down, and it broke down in its volume. So that's interesting. Last but not least is a manufacturing, excuse me, a manufactured bin. You can see these, I call these the Darth Vader helmet style. So again, this was filled up about 3/4, or I'd say 2/3 of the way. Okay, well, not a lot going on in here either. But the material certainly did break down. The difference between that wire bin and this one is that this one is dry, dusty. Those are probably like, I don't know what that is. Super dusty, super dry. Even all the rain that we had, well, that's not too bad either. That looks a lot like the compost that's in the 3-tiered bin over there. Yeah, that's not half bad. I would put that in my garden. It's a little dusty. That's kind of weird. Yeah, but this is easily 6 months old. So this is what happens when you don't do anything. If you build up a pile, we've got some crabgrass growing in there. So in the real world, what I would do once I built up a compost as high 2/3 in a Darth Vader bin like this, you can buy them online. I think that Wake County is holding their sale. Are they holding it right now? Right this very moment, Wake County has opened up their portal. You don't have to live in Wake County to purchase one of not this particular brand, but very similar. It's just black plastic dome that sits on the ground. It's open to the soil, so decomposers can come up through the soil to get to that delicious food that you put out for them. And it keeps it very contained. They're very tidy. If you have an HOA or something like that, you know, you can, you know, plant a hydrangea or something around it, and just, you know, they're discreet. But they also work really well. They contain the material. They do, even though this one's dry, I didn't water it. All the rain that we've had didn't benefit this in the slightest. You do need to water it, but nonetheless, it does contain the material. It's also nice and sturdy. So if you're worried about critters coming in and digging in your compost, that's, you know, this definitely helps prevent that. And it's got aeration. And from what I understand, these kind of bins are designed so that the aeration is sufficient so that the oxygen will actually penetrate into the center of the pile, no matter what you put in here. So you can be adding your fresh material to the top. Remember, you want to dig a hole, put your fresh material in, cover it up so you're not attracting flies coming in to feed on that. Cover it up, maybe put a layer of leaves on top, water, water, water. And that critical mass, it's going to break down in volume. That moisture is going to gravitate to the bottom of the compost. And so you're going to have essentially, you can create your own digester, right? Where all that nitrogenous waste is breaking down in the center. You're turning the dry exterior into the middle, water it down. So when people say turning their compost, I am not literally turning this. I am turning the contents like you do when you bake a cake, right? You've got the wet egg, in the center, and you turn the dry flour and sugar into the middle. You turn it in and turn it in so that it's all the same moisture level. It's the same thing that you want to do with your compost. You're turning in the dry ingredients. You're keeping the nitrogen in the center. As it gravitates down, it's going to compost toward the bottom. So a lot of these are designed with doors down at the bottom so that you can keep feeding it with fresh material at the top and scoop out your finished compost at the bottom. Hopefully it looks a little better than that if you're doing it right. But like I said, this is passive. This is absolutely passive. If you want more to happen with your compost, do a little more with it. It'll break down faster the more you turn it. It'll break down faster the less dense the materials are that you put in, depending on the density, I should say, and your carbon to nitrogen balance. But this is, if you think about this as like a vertical plane where you've got the fresh materials going into the top and the finishing materials down at the bottom, then you can also think about this as the same kind of system, only it's on the horizontal plane. This is what is known as a 3-tiered bin. And obviously it has 3 compartments. But I'm not currently using it the way that it was designed for. These 3-tiered units are wonderful if you have a high volume of organic matter, or if you really want to produce a lot of compost and you can get a high volume of organic matter. You would start with this. Imagine this is like that manufactured bin. Instead of being on the vertical plane, it's on the horizontal plane. You add your fresh ingredients to this first container and let it cure. Let it break down, I should say, not cure it. Let it break down for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, flip it into the next container, let it break down there, build this up again. It's going to break down, flip it again. After 6 to 8 weeks, you're going to put what's in this container into the last one, and you should have a finished compost, and you can let that sit and cure until you're ready to use it on your landscapes, garden, whatever you want to do. I am not using this, as I said, the way that it is designed, because I only teach a class apparently every 6 months. So, it's like a ghost town here in local government these days. So it's just me and my compost apparently, which is fine, but not a whole lot is happening. So a passive pile works fine. You can choose just about any system that you want. This wire container, so if you have construction skills, let me go back to this for a second. The University of Arkansas, if you Google or search on their website for a 3-tiered wooden wire bin, you will get design. And these are the instructions that we use to build this one. It's not too tricky if you have the right tools and some great help. This wire container, boy, talk about inexpensive, right? I mean, you can get a roll of this wire. You could make 50 of these containers for, $10. The issue is, of course, is that it dries out really quickly. We have had a lot of rain, but in the summertime in the Carolinas, probably the biggest problem that I hear from backyard composters is that it's just dried out, nothing's happening. And so this is almost too aerated. The other problem too is that, you have your finished compost down at the bottom while you're adding fresh material to the top. If you want to get your finished compost out, you're going to have to lift up the whole thing, move it over, get to your finished compost down the bottom, put the fresh materials back on top. That's okay. But for me, I prefer to use this as a leaf storage, and I have it next to my manufactured bin at home. But you know what? I grew up with the ditch method, also a time honored way of composting. Dig a hole in the ground, throw your scraps in there and cover it up. You know, my mom had a pretty sizable garden, and on one side there was a ditch that was active. That's where we were throwing the fresh material or fresh vegetative waste, and you know, cover it with a little bit of soil. And then on the other side was dormant, right? It was fallow. And so then in the spring, she would dig up the fallow ditch, put it in the garden. This one would go fallow, that would become active, and so she rotated this and such to keep the organics flowing through the garden. And she's a very successful gardener, fed a family of 5 largely from what she produced in about a 1/4 acre garden. So my dad too. At any rate, so whether you use a ditch or you make a pile, the principles are the same. The more active you are with it, the more likely it'll break down quickly. However, you can't stop it. So don't be afraid to try. All right, back to my ingredients. So because I know that I want to have a volume of material, I got a lot of different stuff from a variety of different places. I've got my own kitchen scraps, but this isn't going to get me where I want to be to really start a hot pile. So I've been doing this for a number of years, and I've made some good connections. One of them is our local food co-op here in the Chapel Hill Triangle area. We have a co-op called Weaver Street Market, but you've probably got a Whole Foods, you've probably got some, you know, some grocer near you that processes. I mean, this doesn't even look bad. I'm telling you, I'm ready to make a salad, but
Muriel?
whatever. Yes?
Yeah, so we do have a quick question. I was going to answer it, but I'll let you do it.
What's
Give you a chance to take a break real quick. Should your compost bin be in sun or shade, or does it matter?
Great question. So the hot compost that I'm referring to comes from within. So it's really the combination of carbon and nitrogen in that 50-50 percentage in the presence of water that creates that heat surge. If you leave it in the sun, it could, you know, the evaporation rate is really high, so it may dry out faster. I personally like to keep mine in the shade. But it does get some roots from the nearby plants that are shading it. The roots will go up into the compost, and because it's the most nutritious thing around. So there are definitely trade-offs, but personally, I like to keep mine in the shade and let the heat come from inside. How's that? Do you have anything to add, Gary?
No, exactly what I would have said as well. I mean, and adding the concept of the roots is certainly something you've got to be aware of as well. Perfect answer. Mm-hmm. You're rocking.
All right.
Keep going.
Keep on going. All right. So Weaver Street Market, you know, at their produce department, they do nothing but, you know, strip off the dead leaves off things, you know, to make things look pretty, to put out on the shelves. We got a little salt packet. That's interesting. So, you know, when you are getting volunteer material from places, you know, just be aware this is a grocer. So you may end up with this, you know, kind of part 5 particle board, I guess you call it. And I'm assuming because it's an organic grocery that these dyes are probably a vegetable based dye. And this is certainly a carbon source, the paper. And look at those fibers. I think that this would actually break down pretty quickly. So I'm going to consider this a viable carbon source for my compost. Same with the packing paper, same with the paper towels. Now, this is kind of interesting. People do ask about paper towels and you know, food related paper like this. And paper towels, certainly they are made with carbon, and this is like the organic kind. You know, it doesn't have any bleach or you know, that you see in the white paper towels, but a lot of paper towels are made with what they call a wet strength additive. You know, you've seen the advertisements where, you know, with a wet paper towel that can hold a bowling ball or something crazy like that, right? And it's not just the paper that's doing that. They actually add something so that when it gets wet, it actually binds together, and it's a chemical additive. And so it can actually prevent paper towels from breaking down in your compost. So what I suggest is that if you want to compost your paper towels, it's not a problem, but make sure that they're wet. A little secret, this is a handy little compost bucket. A lot of you know, composting programs sell these buckets, and because it is plastic, it does actually, over time, it might absorb some of the odors. and I drink a lot of coffee, as noted. So I take a paper towel, and after I wash out the container, I'll put a paper towel down the bottom, and then it helps keep my container clean. And it also, when I dump it out into my compost, that paper towel goes with it, and it's already been soaked. So you can compost paper towels, but just bear in mind that you want to make sure that they get good and wet. Okay, so that's the same thing with really any food related paper. So the benefit also of going to the produce department is that they're not going to have dairy. It's not gonna have stuff from the cheese department or from the meat department in it. It's going to be strictly fruits and veggies. But you know what? I never know what I'm going to get from Weaver Street. Sometimes I've gotten a bag full of pineapple crowns, mangoes. They still have the produce stickers on them, so it's a wild ride sometimes. But and also bear in mind that you're competing with other people that might want to get it for their compost or to feed their chickens. So this is good. It's waste from the grocer, but this is good nutrition, and there's so many ways that it doesn't need to be landfilled. But my experience is, I go and I have a conversation and let them know what I'm trying to do. If you don't want to go to the grocer, maybe just talk to your neighbors. Talk to your family and friends. I'm trying to build a hot compost and I need volume. Bring me your fruit and veggie scraps. And, chances are you can get just exactly what you need if you explain that you really don't want any dairy or meat or bones or anything like that. So those are usually what a lot of the literature will say, like, don't add any meat, don't add any bones, don't add any dairy. The reason for that is because of the odor that they can cause. I will say, however, that, okay, compost confessions here. I do compost my bones. I do compost my meat. I eat a lot of fish. I've been, since COVID, I've been, roasting my own whole chickens and then making stock with the bones. So I put that into my compost. You can buy bone meal at the garden store. Bones do very well, actually, as a soil additive, but I just make sure that I bury. And I would say my compost is very mature. When you start composting, I wouldn't say like do that right off the bat, but we do learn by doing. I had a roommate who was a Japanese American individual, and he ate fish every single day and was putting the fish heads in the garbage. It smelled, and I'm like, why don't I just put this in my compost? That fish was gone within a couple of days, no sign whatsoever, no odor, and this beautiful compost resulting in it. And so that reminds me of, like Native American wisdom of burying a fish with the crops. That fish protein is just as valuable to soil microorganisms as it is to us, right? That nutrition is hard to come by. So they're going to consume it and turn it into a soil product that is very nutritious. So don't be too afraid of it. Just bury. And if you smell anything, or if you see any, you're attracting something that you don't want to see, then stop. Yeah, you're still doing great with just the fruits and veggies. But anyway, so I keep referring to this balance of carbon and nitrogen. And so this is I'm not done with the nitrogen yet. Sorry, let me keep going here. So another great source of nitrogen in our neighborhoods is coffee roasters. Here in the Triangle, we have a coffee shop about every 3 with the microbrewery and coffee shops. We're very, very fortunate to have these kind of waste materials that are high in organic value to me. And so this came from a coffee shop in Carborough called the Open Eye, and they have a very informal recycling program. They set out buckets of coffee grounds, but really just about any coffee shop, if you have a conversation with them, again, it's just these composting conversations, right? Where, we know this organic matter shouldn't be going into landfill and I can use it in my compost. So even though it's brown and crumbly, looks like dirt, smells like coffee, this is not compost. This is still, it's loaded with nitrogenous waste, or excuse me, nitrogen. Even though the beans have been baked, they are still coffee beans, and this is a good nitrogen source. It comes with the coffee filter. This is your carbon, and it's wet, wet, wet from having gone through the coffee press. So you've got carbon and nitrogen in the presence of water all together from your coffee shop. So this is a great, great mix. Another source of nitrogen that you can come by locally, of course, are manures. This came from a horse farm also in Chapel Hill, Spence's farm. And, you know, I've had a relationship with Spence for a long, long time. And, you know, I just go and ask like, hey, do you mind if I take some of your manure? And usually people are like, well, what's with the bucket? Bring a truck next time, because our horses are doing nothing but pooping all day. And, you know, it is actually a management issue for some farms. Spence actually has a 3-tiered bin similar to this, only it's concrete and it's about 6 times the size. At any rate, so I do get manure from Spence's farm. Like they say, know your farmer, know where you're getting your compost from or your compost ingredients from. There is an issue that has gotten quite a bit of press lately. It's a very disturbing issue of persistent herbicides. And so persistent herbicides can be used to grow the oats and hay that Spence feeds his horses. And then those herbicides are so persistent that it'll actually pass through the horse's gullet into their manure. And I can inoculate unknowingly my compost with a persistent herbicide if I haven't had that conversation, and he may not even know. So the way that you can prevent persistent herbicides from affecting your compost is to only use a small amount. Make sure that it's, from what I understand, less than 8% of your entire mix will, you know, diffuse it enough that it shouldn't be too much of an impact. Also, if you let it age, you know, at least a year if you're really concerned. But, you know, have those conversations too. It's like you know, to see where the food is coming from, but it's really actually very hard to track. So I still like to use manures, however, because also from the horse's gut, thermophilic bacteria, right? They live in a hot environment designed to break down organic matter. And so I inoculate my compost with thermophilic bacteria when I use a manure. So I like using manures to heat it up, but it is not necessary if you don't want to do it, or if you feel like that risk is more than one you want to take. But I'm going to add it because it's not that much compared to the rest of my supply here of my nitrogen. I've got coffee grounds, I've got that big bag of greens from Weaver Street Market. Now we're going to talk about carbon. So newspaper, sure, 5 minutes, 50. Okay, very good. So newspaper, sure, you can use. I prefer to use it in my indoor worm bin. It's you know, soy-based inks. I can tear it up and put it in there. If you don't have any carbon at all, newspaper is good because you know, because it does use the soy-based inks. White paper, they might use bleach and binding, something like that. It's not as nice. But, you know, here in North Carolina, especially Durham, it is called Tree City for a reason. We've got willow oaks all over the place. Even when I lived in a house that had mostly pine trees, I would go driving down the street and see, you know, bags of leaves by the side of the road, see a maple in the middle of the yard, go ahead and shove that bag in my trunk, bring it home, put the leaves in my wire container and have them next to my bin. I'm good to go, because you're going to need carbon all year round, right? Not just in the fall when the leaves are abundant. So figure out some storage mechanism to have your brown leaves year round. You know, also I got this from Spence's. I just picked it up off the top of the pile. This is actually straw. The difference between hay and straw is that hay still has the seeds. Straw is just the dry stalk. So straw is also, dry straw is also a great carbon source if you happen to come across that. Fair warning, when you're picking up bags and things like that, like you don't know, even from your grocer or from your neighbor, there may be other things in there, boards with nails in it, pine cones, pine needles. Even though you know, it is the pine state, pine needles don't break down that well. They have a waxy cuticle, they resist decomposition, they're highly acidic. You can use them in a compost, but you may end up with a beautiful compost in pine needles because they just don't break down that well. So I look for the deciduous tree leaves. And so I'm going to go ahead and start building my pile because that is what we have all come here for.
Muriel, just while you're
Yes.
building that, So
Yes, sir.
I answered the question, but I wanted to get your feedback. We had a question
Okay.
of, do you limit the types of animal manures? Specifically, would you put in domestic animal manures into your compost?
Oh, such a great question. Yeah. So domestic animal manures like cats and dogs. So that is definitely something that I would avoid using, just because their poops can produce some pathogens that are, you know, they're not good for people. You know, I do want it to break down in my hot compost. However, just to err on the side of caution, I would not add those. I had the experience of putting chicken manure in my car one time, and I will never, ever, ever, ever do that again, because it smells to high heaven, and it was like
It does.
something, and it stuck with me for a while too. So so chicken manure definitely works. You can, oh my gosh, so you know, the urea, a very you know, very potent nitrogen source. However, it is a little stinky. If you have chickens, though, you know, you can actually compost the chicken manure with litter, you know, and have your own mix. And of course, they're going to be eating your veggie scraps. So, you know, it's probably the best way to manage the chicken manure is through composting. Cow manure also is fine. From what I understand, you get less, you know, oat or, you know, grass germination, because they have 5 stomachs, and they really digest that down. However, in a cow field, it's like you have to go out in the pasture with the cows. They may or may not like you there with them, hard to tell. And you have to like pick it up and I don't know, it's just a lot more time consuming for me. At a horse barn, generally they have a muck out pile, and it's all piled up right there with bedding from the stall. So you've got a carbon nitrogen mix right there from the horse manure, and its smell is not that bad either if you're hauling it in your car, as whoever is asking that question may end up doing in short order. How's that sound?
That sounds exactly what I would have, how I answered it as well. You just did a lot more detail. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, you know, I mean, the other thing too, I would say, like, it really depends on what you've got. You know, I did have a couple come to one of my classes specifically with the desire of composting their dog manure. And I was like, well, I mean, it is organic, you know, why wouldn't it break down? We can compost human manure, obviously. You know, we compost biosolids here in Durham with our yard waste. And so the thing is, though, because just to err on the side of caution, I told them, like, compost it like you would. And I taught the class with, you know, the nitrogen and the carbon mix. And add your dog poop, but don't put it on your vegetables. You know, don't use it on, don't, like, keep that separate from a compost that you might want to put on your on food that you'll eat. And they came back to another class 6 months later, and they said that it was working out. So go figure. You know, I say, regardless of what organic matter you have at home, or what you know, organic waste issue you're trying to manage, and composting is not a silver bullet, but it's pretty close. You know, if it's smelly, add more carbon. If it's too wet, add more carbon. If you know, if it's too dry, it's not really breaking down, wet it down, turn it up, you know, mix it with your pitchfork, turn it like I'm doing here. So this is all nitrogenous waste, little bit of bread in there. This is kind of chunky, funky stuff. But I encourage you, you know, we learn by doing. At least I do. And, you know, compost is very forgiving. It'll let you know when you're doing something wrong. And once you practice and you can actually understand the language, here's my other favorite tool. It's just an edger, but it works really great as a chopper. Another good one is a garden hoe, especially if the handle's broken. Whap, whap, whap. Just you can really chop up your compost and make it into smaller pieces. Obviously, you know, this leek, how fibrous it is, This is going to take a lot longer to break down than this lettuce, which is already just, I can just flick it apart with my fingers. You know, this is going to take a minute compared to this. Oh, I think our battery is dying. Okay, we'll make it. Okay, so I'm going to add a bucket of this gorgeous coffee grounds because it's going to add some of that moisture that I want, as well as more nitrogen. Fluff it up a little bit. People are like, oh, that's so much work. I don't want to do this. But, you know, bear in mind, I did this once, you know, 6 months ago, and it broke down okay. The more you turn it, the more you mix it, generally the faster it's going to break down. But if you only dig a hole in the center and put your nitrogenous waste in the center and then cover it up, you're still doing a good job. Don't worry. Let's see, I'm gonna throw my manure in the center. This also has straw in it. It's that gorgeous mix of carbon and nitrogen. Just gonna flick it together. Now, like I said, the only problem with this site is that I don't have a hose. And if I had my druthers, I would be watering this as I go. See these dry leaves? I want those in there and I want them wet. So that's another reason why when we dug into this compost, that it was still kind of crumbly, had a lot of that carbon. It actually looks really darn good. I gotta say, it's not bad at all. Who needs a gym membership if you're a composter? I mean, so I want to bring up, if here, Kate, you want to come on in? So I'm looking at this. To my eye, I would call this about, you know, if we have more nitrogen than carbon in here. So I'm going to bring up my carbon level a little bit, and I'm mixing it now. So I'm going to add the leaves now. I could layer this and then do it like that, but because I'm short, oh, we can talk about compostable plastics. There, now we're talking. This is a really good balance. So will this coffee cup break down? I can barely tear it with my fingers, and look at this. It's got this plastic liner. Now this is a compostable plastic, but in my backyard composting bin, this isn't going to do as well as it might in an industrial system like you know, they have here in Durham, that Atlas or that McGill might use, or Brooks in Chatham County. We have some amazing commercial composting companies here in the state of North Carolina. I don't know where y'all are from, but this kind of film, you know, it serves as a moisture barrier. So I really don't want this in my backyard compost, and my compost may not get hot enough, especially since I'm going to abandon it for a while, to actually break those materials down. So these, you know, compostable plastics, I mean, okay, but in a backyard bin, really, they're not going to break down the way that you want them to. And it's even, I mean, sometimes they don't even break down in an industrial system, and that's a problem too. They have to be fed over and over and over again, and sometimes they just end up being discarded. But better than petroleum-based, I suppose. But not in my backyard bin, because it just probably won't break down. Same thing with these compostable plastic bags. Where'd it go? This one. You know, it'll break into smaller and smaller pieces eventually, but I'm not going to put that in my compost bin. So let's see, where are we? I'm going to add another layer of nitrogen. Here with my good old coffee grounds. Turn those buckets to the open eye, because if you're a composter, buckets are a commodity. And the good thing about these tiered systems is that I can stack it the height that I need it. And you may not be able to tell on camera, but I'm only 5 feet tall. So having something that I can get into that doesn't, that isn't too high for me to dig into really serves me well. It's another reason why I like the Darth Vader bins, is because they're only about 3 feet tall. So I can still get in there and really enthusiastically turn the material. So I'm looking at that and I'm still seeing quite a bit of nitrogen, but it's also dry. So I'm going to do my little bit of water. So with this 3-tiered bin with the net around it, the hardware cloth, it's going to dry out really quickly too. So one of the ways with my backyard bin that I keep it moist, when I bring out my kitchen scraps, I actually fill the bucket with water and then empty it out, because it's going to need a swish anyway. With all the coffee that I drink, it's going to need to be cleaned. So I swish it with some water and then whoosh the whole thing into my backyard bin. So now I'm just going to cover it up. I'm going to add this straw, which probably has a little bit of nitrogen in it too, compared to leaves. Break up that tile flake, I think it's called. Oh, doesn't that look nice? I wish I had a little bit more water, because that is just a little bit too dry. But imagine, I'm going to water it down to 60–70% saturation. Then I'm going to let it cook. Last but not least,
You get rain this afternoon and water it down naturally for you.
That's exactly right. So it's a pro and con of having a lid on the compost, is that the rain will water it, but then the sun will dry it out. So I actually prefer to have a lid on the compost so that I can control the moisture. I'm just going to cover it up with this layer of carbon, because I don't want any critters and I don't want to breed flies. This is a work site after all. And if I'm attracting things that people don't want to see, then it's going to give composting a bad name. And nobody wants that. So that's it. I would water this down to where it's good and wet. That 60–70% saturation. The rain will do it this afternoon. But this pile, I think, is sufficient to get hot. At least warm up a little over the next couple of days. So can you see what I did? So I just shoved the thermometer in nice and deep with that long probe, and we'll see what happens for the next couple of days. So I have some other things that I could talk about, but are there any questions? This stuff that that people want me to address specifically.
So just had a question came in is, can you explain how you turn your Darth Vader bin? Will turning it too much expose the food scraps to the air holes?
Oh, that's a great question. So I can demonstrate that sort of make-believe way. Well, here, I've got a little bit of stuff here. So the way I would turn it is the way I described with the cake analogy. Let's imagine, if you will, that it has more substance. But right now we only have about, oh gosh, maybe 8 inches of compost on the bottom and all that crabgrass. Now, if I was turning it regularly, this crabgrass would not be thriving. Nothing would, when you disturb it, then ants won't build a nest, mosquitoes won't thrive if you do turn it regularly. So I would the material around the edge where the air vents are, those are going to dry out. So if I'm going to dig a little hole in the center, drop my food waste in the center, just like that. And then I'm going to take the stuff on the edge and cover it up. Boom, boom, boom. Cover, cover, cover. Water, water, water. The microbes get so excited. They love it. They love the added oxygen. Gives them a little verve and that nitrogen that's going to feed them. So then I cover it up. Now imagine, if you will, I have a hose and I water it all. And I water it down. So I hope that helps. From time to time, when I'm feeling really energetic and I really want to mix it up, I get right in there and I dig and I dig and I dig and I get down to where it's, breaking down more towards the bottom, and I bring up some of that fixed material up towards the top, just to, bring some of those bacteria that are finishing off the pile up into the more raw ingredients, and, scoop around, get all the dried mixture into the center so that it's all mixed together fresh, and then cover it again with leaves and then water it down. Okay. Does that, it's a little bit of make-believe here, a little bit of Fred Rogers here, imagination station, but yeah, that's how I do it. But like I said, there's nothing wrong with just, digging a little hole, throwing your food on top of it, and then walking away, covering it up and then walking away. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. An outdoor pile that isn't contained like this, it will have a tendency to lose its nutrients to the system, as it rains, and, the moisture will take those nutrients away through the soil. So it's another reason that I like a container, and I like also to try to break down my my food scraps as quickly as possible, because it contains that nutrient content the faster it breaks down. And, since I am going to use it as a compost in my garden, I want that nutrient content to go into the food that I eat. So that's my interest. But you know what? People get busy. They don't want to work that hard at it. The compost will do what it does. And then if it's, you can still get your fixed material out of the bottom. And to be honest, it's one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the churning units. Not, some people really like them because you don't actually necessarily need to use a pitchfork, but since they tumble, number one, they're up off the ground. And so you're not getting the benefit of as many decomposers coming up through the soil. Why you would want to put a composter in the air, I don't know, but people do it. And you do still get that mix of carbon and nitrogen. Certainly there's microbes there, but if the compost is finishing, if it's actually breaking down, you're adding fresh material, it's continually getting mixed. So you really need a second one to let it compost, let it break down while you're adding fresh material to another. So you still need to have that sort of tiered effect, or where one is active and the other one is passive. And I've seen tumbling units now that actually have two canisters side by side. So they must have heard me, because that was probably one of my greatest complaints. Like, how do you harvest your finished compost if you're mixing it all together? So this way you can have one that's actually, finishing being composted and curing while you're adding fresh material to the other. But it does, the amount that you work it and the type of compost that you end up with can vary, depending on how you do it. This is actually my vermicompost compost, which is nice and rich, and has virtually, you can't identify anything in it at all. And this is actually a biosolids compost that's made by our composting contractor here in the city of Durham, a company called Atlas Organics. And they take the yard waste material collected by the city and grind it and then mix it with the city's biosolids at the water treatment facility. And you can see there's quite a bit of carbon in there. You can still see quite a bit of wood chips. They screen it rather well. But, I use this on my garden, and it's good stuff. You need a dump truck, though, at least, to come and buy it. Just saying. All right. Any other questions? I think we're just about on time. Oh, I do have a couple more things real quick. If you want to learn more, this is my favorite book ever. It is like curl up in the bed with popcorn and read the delightful hundreds of different ways that you can actually compost. these women, let's see, what are their names? Barbara Pleasant and Deborah Martin, the Complete Compost Gardening Guide. So they love to compost, and they do things like grow heaps if you want to grow giant pumpkins, or if you have hay bales, like growing out of the center of those, all kinds of different containers that you can use to compost and then also grow in. They're just really fun to read, and lots of creative ideas, and a lot of really good science too. They talk a lot about the bacteria, the ecosystem, and the chemical components of the foods that we eat, and how that can actually create a really nutritious compost to benefit the food that we grow. And also, if you are interested in vermicomposting, this is a seminal work by a woman named Mary Applehoff. She's no longer with us, but her work lives on. Worms Eat My Garbage is a guide that is informed probably millions of people by now on how to vermicompost, and this system is based on her work. All right, now that's it. Oh, wait, no, there's more. If you want to learn more, you can always go to the North Carolina Composting Council website. The U.S. Composting Council also has some great webinars that are coming up if you're interested in compostable plastics or carbon sequestration that can occur when we put compost back in the soils. Those are a couple webinars that are coming up, and I guess have an awesome end to International Compost Awareness Week.
Thank you very much, Muriel. I actually had already added the link in there for the North Carolina Compost Council for everybody. So thank you for mentioning that. Wonderful job. Thanks everybody for participating. It's just about 15 minutes past noon. So we will get the recording out. I believe Kate's going to do that. And if there's any additional questions, go right ahead.
I have one more thing. So we have some International Compost Awareness Week posters. I think the background that is Gary's background on the Zoom is an image from that poster. It was actually created by a young Russian high school student, growing graphics designer who imagined the tubers in her garden being loved by the compost molecules. So it's a really charming poster, truly an international example of compost impacting our lives. So if you want a poster, both Kate and I have a couple extras. Just put your contact in the chat, and Gary can harvest that information. We'll get you one.
Excellent. Or go to info@carolinacompost.com and then send us an email as well. We did have a last question. Where can they find the upcoming seminars? I just put in the chat the website for the U.S. Composting Council, so you can go there and learn more about the upcoming webinars as well. Correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Have a great rest of International Compost Awareness Week and a great weekend. Thank you, Muriel.
Take care.
Bye-bye.